She knew something was going to happen to her, so she wrote it all down, and she hid it where only the truth could eventually find it. Lori Pearce was 43 years old when she died at the bottom of a staircase inside her rural El Dorado County home on a cold November morning in 2019. Her husband, Charles Pearce, made the call to 911. His voice was measured. His story was simple. She had fallen. It was an accident, a tragic, terrible accident. And for a while, longer than it should have taken, the world believed him. But Lori had been preparing for this moment for years. Not the dying. The being believed. Because she understood, the way so many women in her position come to understand that when she was gone, Charles would be the one doing the talking. He would shape the story. He would control the narrative the same way he had controlled everything else: her finances, her friendships, her freedom, the very hours of her day. So Lori did the only thing she could do. She picked up a pen. She opened a journal. And she started writing. She wrote about the first time he shoved her into a wall and then apologized with flowers. She wrote about the time he told her that if she ever tried to leave, she wouldn't make it to the end of the driveway. She wrote about the nights she spent lying awake in a house that felt less like a home and more like a cell, calculating distances to the nearest neighbor, wondering if the phone would still be charged in the morning. She wrote dates. She wrote times. She wrote what he said, word for word in quotation marks, as though she already understood these entries might one day be read by strangers in a courtroom. She was meticulous. She was deliberate. And she was terrified. Lori Pearce did not hide her journals carelessly. She tucked them into places Charles would never think to look. Inside boxes shoved to the back of closets, behind loose paneling in a spare room, places that required patience and premeditation to find. This was not the behavior of an unstable woman. This was the behavior of a woman who was building a case. Charles Pearce had spent years telling anyone who would listen that Lori was mentally fragile, emotionally volatile, unreliable. He said she had a tendency to exaggerate, to misremember, to spiral. He worked to establish this reputation carefully and consistently, the way abusers so often do, eroding a woman's credibility before she ever gets the chance to use it. It is a calculated form of cruelty. It turns the victim's own voice into something that sounds suspicious. But Lori anticipated that too. That is why the journals were so detailed. That is why she included names, witnesses who had seen bruises, friends he had threatened to isolate her from, a neighbor who had heard shouting through the walls one summer evening. That is why she noted specific phrases he used, specific warnings he issued. She was not writing to process her pain. She was writing to be believed. When first responders arrived at the Pearce home that November morning, the scene appeared consistent with an accidental fall. The staircase was steep. There were no immediate signs of a struggle. Charles was visibly shaken, composed in a way that read as shock rather than anything more sinister. Investigators processed the scene, took his statement, and within hours, Lori Pearce's death was being treated as a tragic accident. Charles arranged the funeral. He accepted the condolences. He moved through the following weeks the way grieving husbands do, and the case quietly settled into the inactive file. But something nagged. There is often one investigator, sometimes a detective, sometimes a forensic examiner, sometimes just a determined advocate, who refuses to let a case breathe too easily. In Lori's case, it was a combination of factors that refused to stay quiet. A family member who had seen the bruises over the years, a friend who reached out to investigators with concerns, and a forensic pathologist who, upon closer examination of Lori's injuries, noted patterns that were difficult to reconcile with a simple fall down a staircase. The injuries told a more complicated story. The positioning, the specific nature of the trauma, things that raised questions that a fresh accident scene might answer one way and a staged scene might answer another. Investigators went back. They looked harder. They obtained a warrant. and they found the journals. It is difficult to describe what it must have been like for the detectives who sat down with those handwritten pages, page after page, of Lori's careful, steady handwriting, building a timeline of abuse that stretched back years. The entries were not hysterical, they were not incoherent. They were precise and organized and devastating in their clarity. She had written them knowing they might be dismissed as the ravings of an unstable woman, so she had written them in a way that made dismissal impossible. One entry, written approximately 8 months before her death, described a confrontation in which Charles had told her explicitly that she would never be able to leave him, that the only way out was in a box. She had underlined those words. She had written the date in the margin. And then, in a sentence that stopped prosecutors cold when they read it aloud in court, she had written, "If something happens to me, he did it. Don't let him tell you otherwise." She knew. She knew, and she still could not escape. That is the reality of intimate partner violence that so many people struggle to understand from the outside. The mechanism of entrapment is not just physical. It is financial, psychological, social, and deeply personal. Leaving is the most dangerous moment for a victim. The threat of lethal violence spikes in the period surrounding separation. Lori Pearce was not passive. She was not weak. She was navigating one of the most dangerous situations a human being can face, and she was doing it with extraordinary intelligence and foresight. Charles Pearce was arrested in 2021, more than a year after Lori's death. He maintained his innocence. He continued to characterize Lori as emotionally unstable, her journals as the product of an obsessive and distorted mind. His defense attempted to reframe her meticulous documentation as evidence of paranoia rather than survival. The prosecution had a different framing. They let Lori speak. Entry by entry, the journals were introduced into evidence. The forensic evidence supported what she had written: the injuries, the timeline, the pattern of escalating violence. Witnesses who had been silenced by fear or social pressure came forward to corroborate specific incidents she had recorded. Friends described seeing her flinch when Charles entered a room. A former co-worker testified that Lori had confided in her about threats and had seemed to be living in a state of constant, quiet dread. The trial lasted several weeks. In 2023, Charles Pearce was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. Lori Pearce never got to testify. She never got to sit across from a jury and tell them what her life had become behind the walls of that house in El Dorado County. She never got to hear a verdict. She never got to walk out of a courtroom into daylight and know that she had been believed. But she had engineered exactly that outcome anyway. There is something profound and heartbreaking in that. In the image of a woman alone in a house that frightened her, carefully hiding the truth in the spaces between walls, trusting that someone would eventually look. She was not passive. She was not silent. She was preparing. She was building the case that her abuser was simultaneously working to destroy, and she was doing it one handwritten sentence at a time. The journals of Lori Pearce are now part of the public record of People versus Charles Pearce. They will exist long after every person involved in this case is gone. They are her testimony. They are her refusal to disappear. For anyone living inside a situation like Lori's, there are